the doghouse. Lady, the little dog who lived with Jim, Dear, and Darling, had always been a loyal and loving companion. As winter settled in, however, a new concern weighed heavily on her heart. The cold winds began to howl through the trees. The snow covered the ground in a thick, frosty blanket, and the air seemed to chill right to the bone. Every day, Lady would press her cold nose against the frosty window, gazing out at the wintry landscape. Her eyes always searched for Tramp, her friend, who stubbornly refused to come inside. Instead, he roamed through the snow, his ears twitching at every sound, his paws leaving tracks in the powdery white as he trotted through the yard. "I know Lady worries about Tramp being outside," Darling sighed one evening, stroking Lady's soft fur. "But you know how Tramp is. He's a wanderer, and he doesn't like being cooped up, even in the cold. He loves his freedom too much." Jim Dear, who had been watching from the doorway with concern, suddenly had an idea. "I know what I'll do," he said, his face lighting up with a spark of inspiration. "I'll build Tramp a kennel. That way he can have a warm place to rest, but still feel free to wander around when he wants to." The next morning, Jim Dear went to the hardware store to gather wood, nails, and all the necessary supplies. He was determined to make the best kennel ever for his friend Tramp. He worked all day, hammering, sawing, and occasionally muttering to himself when things didn't go quite as planned. "Ouch," he cried once, hitting his thumb with the hammer. Darling, who had been watching from the kitchen window, came outside with a warm cup of tea in hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern in her voice as she saw Jim holding his thumb in pain. "Just a little bump," Jim said, wincing but trying to smile. He took the tea, but his determination didn't falter. It's all part of the process. As the day wore on, Jim tried his best to measure the planks of wood. The kennel's frame wobbled as Jim tried to piece everything together, and at one point he even had to redo a part because it was crooked. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, but Jim kept going. Finally, just as the last light of day began to fade, he stepped back, wiped his brow, and declared, "Done." The kennel was modest, but it was sturdy enough. Jim looked over at Lady, who had been sitting nearby, watching him the whole time, her eyes filled with hope. Darling, who had been inside getting the last of the dinner ready, came out and took a look. "Nice," she said with a smile, although she could tell it wasn't quite perfect. "Let's see if Tramp likes it," they called to Tramp, who had been circling the yard, sniffing around and wagging his tail. The little dog trotted over eagerly, his head tilting slightly as he examined the kennel. But as Tramp tried to step inside, he stopped suddenly. His tail drooped, and he looked up at Jim with a puzzled expression. "Oh no, darling," sighed. "It's too tiny." Jim's face fell, disappointment clouding his features. The opening to the kennel was too narrow for Tramp to fit through comfortably. Tramp tried to wriggle inside, but it was clear that the kennel wasn't meant for a dog as big as him. "I'm sorry, Tramp," Jim said, looking apologetically at the dog. Tramp, ever the good sport, simply wagged his tail, clearly not upset, but simply content to explore the yard again. Just then, their neighbor's Scotty dog, Jock, wandered over. Jock was a curious little fellow who loved to check out what everyone was doing. He sniffed the edges of the kennel and then, without hesitation, stepped right inside. He immediately curled up in the soft bedding Jim had placed inside, sighed contentedly, and started to snore peacefully. Jim and Darling both laughed at the sight. "Well, Jock loves it," Darling said, amused by the little dog's obvious enjoyment. Jim, who was still a little disappointed that Tramp hadn't been able to use the kennel, smiled at the sight of Jock snuggled comfortably inside. "I'll make a bigger one for Tramp soon," he said with determination. "But for now, at least, Jock is warm and safe." Lady wagged her tail, happy that someone had a cozy place to stay. As the night drew in and the wind howled outside, she felt a little lighter knowing that Jock was warm and that Tramp, though stubborn, always had a place to come to if he needed it.
Thank you for joining us on this magical journey tonight. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let your dreams carry you to wonderful adventures. Sweet dreams, little dreamers. Good night.